Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for attending our most recent 30-minute commercial webinar. Today we are talking all about construction and from dream to nightmare and everything in between. My name is Maura Snabes. I'm the SVP Corporate Counsel for Corporate Settlement Solutions. And with me today is David Glenn. David is an attorney with a partner with Kuhn Rogers in Traverse City. He practices in the areas of real estate, litigation, construction, business, and environmental law. He represents clients in both transactional and litigation capacities, and he is a graduate of the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law, which is where I also graduated from. He graduated in 2011. I graduated many years before that. And he has been recognized as the one to watch by best lawyers in 2021, 22, and 23. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Sure. For our webinar participants out there, please feel free to type questions into the chat box at any time during the webinar, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation to answer for you. So, David, we're going to be exploring a few different perspectives in the world of construction and the commercial front. But before we dive into that, is there any best overall advice that you have for everyone when it comes to construction of a commercial building or development?
Sure, it's more life advice than anything else. I'd like to say don't bite off more than you can chew, but with a commercial construction project, I think that's a given. Everybody bites off more than they can chew. It usually becomes much larger and more complex and expensive and everything else than what was originally anticipated. So I guess the general advice or cliche, I should say, would be don't bite off more than you can swallow. You don't want this project to destroy you. It's very high risk, high reward. A lot of these construction projects are these commercial construction projects. And I've unfortunately seen it many times where it has either destroyed a developer, a construction company, just by the sheer magnitude of the project and the fact that they put all their eggs in one basket. So be very, very cognizant of the fact that this is a major project and don't bite off more than you can ultimately swallow.
Yeah, great advice. And I agree. I mean, there's so many times the developer enters into a project or even a homeowner and they have a budget and the budget is always blown, right? I mean, there's always change orders, always things that come up that aren't anticipated. So you have to be prepared, especially on the commercial front, because those changes and those unexpected costs can be into the tens of thousands, if not more. So I completely agree with that. So what unique challenges does commercial construction pose that aren't seen on the residential front?
Well, I alluded to it a little bit in my previous answer, but with commercial projects, especially large commercial projects, just the scale and complexity of the project is much different than your general residential construction. You have typically larger buildings, larger budgets, more contractors. Everything is larger and more complex, so it takes a lot of facilitating, takes a lot of planning. You really need to plan and research upfront the project very thoroughly. There's a greater emphasis on hiring qualified professionals that you wouldn't normally have with your general residential construction, from architects to attorneys, to engineers, and environmental consultants. You want to bring as many of those people in as possible, especially when you have a large construction. You're not going to see that in your general residential construction. There's also unique regulations that are more onerous, more complex than you would have with a normal residential construction. Safety is also seems to be more of a concern with commercial construction. You have more requirements, local, federal, state requirements and regulations that come into play that you don't normally see with your standard residential construction. There's also very tight time deadlines generally, because time is money. It's just a little different than residential. People want to get their commercial building up and running And along with those tight deadlines, oftentimes are penalties, especially when you do governmental commercial construction work. And those can be devastating if you're not prepared for them and you're not following the timeline as precisely as you can.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And as far as commercial construction, you're dealing with governmental entities a lot more frequently to try to get through all the red tape. And especially if it's a governmental entity that's hiring you as the project manager or developer, if you will. So a lot more to go through. And, you know, we rarely see those penalty clauses in a residential contract. Because the leveraging just isn't there. But on the commercial, yeah, again, that can add up to be thousands, tens of thousands of dollars. And the general manager may not have complete control over all of their subs. So that's where they need to do their due diligence to investigate them before they hire them to make sure and hold their feet to the fire too. So,
Especially in a post-pandemic world with supply chain and labor shortages, you have very little control over the schedules of your subs. So you have to
right.
factor that in when you're considering timetables on a very complex, multifaceted commercial construction.
Yeah, and that leads right into my next question. What were or are the largest changes in the commercial construction world during the pandemic and then post-pandemic that you've seen?
Well, I think a lot of them are pretty obvious. We all lived through it. You had an increased emphasis on safety, sometimes over the top in a certain respect. Now some of those have come back, but there has been a heightened safety consideration that new projects are experiencing that they didn't before the pandemic. You obviously, like I said before, had supply chain disruptions. That really has opened a lot of people's eyes as to how to manage these projects and how to set timetables, how to set budgets. Building materials are still extremely high. They've come down maybe or at least leveled off from the height of the pandemic, but they very rarely go all the way back down, and they have not. So the building materials are still very high, which factors into how to budget for a commercial construction. You also saw a pretty big boom in commercial construction during the pandemic or immediately right after, just because the availability of low interest loans or no interest loans.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there was a lot more cash on hand for people. You're starting to see that level off and fall because of the high interest rates.
Right.
There was somewhat of a boom. What you'll see now, as far as, and I think we'll get to this later, but trends, you're not seeing as many office buildings, that's for sure. It's a lot. People are working from home, so there's a lot of empty office buildings, and there's not a lot of office buildings being constructed. So there's a lot of different things that have changed since the pandemic. Some of them for the better. I think it was a reality check for a lot of developers, construction companies, and buyers as to how to manage a project so you don't get in over your head and over budget and everything else.
Right. So you're seeing that loosen up a little bit and get a little bit back to normal, more back to normal.
As far as yeah, I mean, I think we're all getting back to normal in a sense, but I think there's things that are here to stay. I mean, for example, it's not construction related, but you and I talked before the podcast about the fact that I'm a litigator and I haven't been to court in, years almost. We very
Right.
rarely go to court. If you would have said that that was going to happen before the pandemic, we'd say, oh, we're attorneys, we have to be in court. Well, things change, and the pandemic has really shaped how the future is going to look, and a lot of it is online or off-site, which,
Mhm.
with construction, you're still going to have guys on site doing the labor, but there are still a lot of things that are now done off-site that weren't before. So there's
Mhm.
just a lot of challenges. I think a lot of them are obvious because they apply equally to every industry and every facet of life.
True. True. Right. Okay. The highlight of this webinar are horror stories.
Sure.
So horror stories. Construction gone bad. So we all want to hear a couple or a few of your best horror stories of construction gone bad, and then how it could have been prevented.
Sure. the one major one is actually an ongoing case that I have right now. Involved a state project, and it involved a lot of almost multiple levels of general contractors. You had the initial general contractor that signed a contract with the state, but they almost didn't have any employees or really had any intention to do any of the work. They were going to delegate it out to almost another level of general contractor, which was with my client in this situation. And then my client did some of the work, but then relied heavily on a lot of subs to finish the scope of work. And with each level, starting from the state on down, there was construction contract integration, for lack of a better term, meaning that at each level, the lower level would adopt all the provisions of and terms and obligations of the contract above them. And some
Mhm.
of them didn't even read those contracts. And
Mm.
what happened was the project became an absolute disaster, and all the blame, right, as it always does, flows downhill. And you can point fingers when it flows downhill, but this is actually contractually the lower people are obligated to the upper people. And so you just have this disaster where it was out of everybody's hands, other than this. Actually, the state somewhat dropped the ball because the water table in this case was much higher than they had anticipated. But all these contracts relied on that data and actually accepted it as being true and accepted all the liability if it
Mhm.
wasn't true. So they're liable to the state for essentially the state's bad data, which caused delay. And now that the project has been delayed or was delayed, there's punitive damages. And unfortunately, at the end of this case, you might end up with a few companies that are essentially bankrupt just based on
Mhm.
the penalty provisions and all the labor materials they provided to a project that, one, they're not going to get paid for, and two, they might be on the hook for damages even above and beyond that. So I
Right.
guess the big takeaway is never sign a contract that incorporates another contract that you haven't read, and do a very thorough investigation of what the scope of work is and the data that your work is going to rely on. And just make sure, as we said at the beginning, that you're not biting off more than you can swallow. That if this project doesn't go right, that it's not going to destroy your entire business, because it's
Right.
high reward with these types of projects.
Hmm. So you may be going into court for this.
No, I've been in court. I've been in court many
Yeah.
times on this one, but it's the Zoom,
Okay.
pretend court.
Yeah. And the liability, as you were saying, it trickles down. The lower you go, the smaller the pockets, right? So they're not the deep pockets. So they're going to get those lowest level people and bankrupt them, possibly, and then
Then it
move up
bounces
the
back
chain, and
up.
then move
Yep.
up the chain until they get all their money.
Yep.
So that's really unfortunate when it puts somebody out of business.
Yeah,
So,
and everybody's intentions were pure at the beginning. It was a failure to do due diligence, and it was a failure to fully understand the scope, and too much reliance on the client, the state's data, without doing their own independent investigation. Because you're
mhm.
going to have enough with these projects that are unforeseeable. So you want to at least find everything that you can possibly foresee with investigation.
Yeah. And you're not going to hold the state feet to the fire for them having made an error. There's
They
just
generally, yeah, they're not very good at that. They
no.
like to get the money, but they generally don't like to accept any fault.
Right, exactly. I remember I had a construction horror story. It was in the residential realm, but it's where the title company was doing the draws, we were doing the draws, and the lender was approving the money going out the door. And we were about three-quarters of the way through, and the lender finally sent out an inspector to find out how far along the project was in relation to the money that was dispersed. And they found out that the only thing that was on the property was the foundation, and they had already agreed to disperse over 300,000. And so that is very unfortunate also. So they're going to have to go back, on the builder who's been asking for this money directly. But from a title company standpoint, they had no liability. And so from a lender standpoint, my advice would always be to make sure you're doing inspections before you approve release of any funds for the current draw, so that you know that that amount of work that they're claiming is done is actually done.
Yeah, that's great advice. And one other, a little more general, because I've had multiple cases, multiple horror stories that relate to the same theme, which is document your change orders, have a very, very clear procedure, simple and clear procedure, depending on all sides, on how those change orders are approved, accepted, paid, because it seems like probably 60% of my construction cases deal with changes to the project, and almost all of them weren't documented at all, weren't documented properly.
Mhm.
And it's just a mess with trying to say, because someone is going to say, I didn't approve that change. But if you're the
Mhm.
contractor, you're going to say, oh, yes, you did. I have a perfectly signed change order, but that never seems to happen. So I would
Yeah.
emphasize it, and they slow the project down. They're a pain, but they are probably the most important thing to do while the project is going, is to document any changes, because there's always going to be changes. And if there's always going to be changes in a residential project, there's going to be 10 times, 100 times the changes in a major commercial construction.
Right. Yeah. It just is amplified. Everything is amplified on the commercial construction front.
Correct.
So if you're a commercial real estate broker and a buyer's agent on the sale of a newly completed commercial construction, what should you do on behalf of the buyer to ensure that the buyer is protected, gets the best warranties, assurances, etc.? And this can apply to an attorney too, who is representing a buyer who is acquiring new commercial construction. So anything?
Sure. I think, if to the extent you can get them, do your own investigation as to the quality of the build, even before you get into reps and warranties and inspections. Do a review of, if possible, the original construction contract, the plans, everything else, to see what the specs of that building are, if it is indeed a new build, just to see if you can identify any potential issues. In the actual purchase agreement, you're going to want to include warranties and guarantees as to workmanship. You have a little more protection in a residential setting than you do in a commercial.
Mhm.
Um, Try and negotiate extended warranties. It's amazing that you get a 3-year warranty on a new car, but in a commercial building, you essentially get no warranty unless you agree to it. So you want a long extended warranty, because there are always going to be issues with the project, even if it's a well-built project, it's a new
Mhm.
build. And there's always going to be things that need to be taken care of. And you don't want to be the one to have to take care of those after you just spent a ton of money to purchase a building. You don't want to have to make those repairs when it really was because of faulty workmanship or defects in the actual construction.
Mhm.
You're going to want to include as many contingencies as you can or need, depending on what you want to do with the property. You want contingencies, obviously finance contingencies. You want zoning, land use contingencies if you need them. If you're gonna need approval for whatever you're gonna want to do, unless it's already zoned properly, which it seems like this day and age is very seldom the case. So
Right.
you're going to want to make sure that this building that you're purchasing is going to be proper for what you want to use it for. And you don't want to be in a position where you're left with a building that you can't use the way you intended, when you could contract those contingencies in.
Mhm.
So basically comes down, in my mind, to get the best warranties and length of warranties that you can, and make sure you consider all the contingencies that you need in order to see this project come to fruition.
Okay. Great.
And work
Um,
with a real estate attorney, right? That's it. Trying to
Absolutely.
keep us employed. It's never, it's somewhat of an expense, but I mean, if you're gonna purchase a major commercial building, have a real estate attorney involved.
Absolutely. Yeah. As a buyer, you absolutely want to do that. Um, that way you have someone to sue too if they don't do a good job, but
Right.
that never happens. So,
Yep.
um, I want to get to environmental concerns, but before I do that, let's look at it from a lender perspective. So, a lender is going to get a loan policy, and what kind of endorsements? Are there any special endorsements from a lender's perspective, and I guess from a buyer's insured perspective, on what endorsements they should be asking for when
As
we're
far
talking
as
about commercial construction?
in general, or as far as environmental specifically?
Not environmental. Well, I mean, you can talk about environmental too, but I'm talking about from a lender, maybe a future advanced mortgage, zoning endorsements,
Correct.
if
Yeah.
we're doing yeah, those kind of things.
Yeah. As far as the policy, you want survey coverage on a commercial build. You want zoning coverage. You want to make sure that the project that if you're a lender that you're putting a mortgage on and you're expecting it to be a certain type of business operating there, that it actually can under the current zoning framework or the intended zoning. So
Hmm.
there's really a number of different endorsements you can get. You can get building permit coverage. It's an exhaustive list. Um, my suggestion would be to sit down and look at the realities of the project, see what needs to happen, the current status of the project, and the type of zoning that's in place, the type of regulations that are in place, what needs to happen in order to get this up and running, because you want to have the maximum value for your security as if you're a lender.
Hmm.
Well, that's really going to be a very specific evaluation for an individual project, because really the sky's the limit on what endorsements are available.
Hmm.
And it's kind of a la carte. You pick and choose which ones you believe are necessary. But in order to do that, you want to make sure that you've evaluated the project fully, so you're not left after the fact wishing you had an endorsement that you don't have.
Right.
As far as a future advance or construction draw endorsement, those are necessary because you want to make sure that a mechanics lien doesn't come in after your initial title policy is in place and reduce, take priority over the remaining amount of the draw.
Right.
So if you have that endorsement in there, then you're protected for the full amount, and it takes priority over any contractor's lien that comes after the fact.
Right. Yeah. So for every construction mortgage that we insure, we issue those pending disbursement endorsements, which kicks out the mechanics lien coverage through a later date. And a lot of times lenders are asking for survey endorsements, as you mentioned. They should be getting an ALTA survey if they're doing a commercial construction project or any construction project for that matter, because you want to make sure that the legal description on your mortgage is the same as on your title policy, is the same as on your survey. Access typically is a free endorsement. And then we have an environmental and covenants, conditions, restrictions, all to 9. There's a variety of those. Some are free, some have a charge associated with them. So again, yes, review what kind of coverage you're really looking for. And of course, the zoning is always asked for too on the commercial side. So let's talk a little bit about environmental, because you have some specialty in that. And tell me what your advice is, again, with regard to the purchase agreement, with regard to what a buyer needs to look for and what a lender needs to look for when they are putting a mortgage on a property that may have some environmental concerns, or purchasing from a buyer's perspective.
Yeah. Well, even if you don't have concerns about environmental issues, just the scope and size of a commercial project generally, even if you don't have concerns, get your phase one. Potentially, if there is contamination identified in the phase one environmental analysis, you jump to a phase two, which is more in-depth data analysis and testing, soil testing, and things like that. And if that identifies uh, uh, contamination above the requisite level, then you're technically a facility under the state regulations, and you'll have to do, and then you'll set a baseline environmental analysis, which will set it so you're protected liability wise. You just can't increase that contamination. And under the Superfund statutes with the state and CERCLA with the feds, you're capped at liability as long as you don't exacerbate that contamination, which
Mhm.
is huge. I mean, in a commercial, I'm in Traverse City, and it seems like every commercial property in Traverse City has some level of contamination. So you're always going to want to do that testing. You're going to want to put contingencies in the purchase agreement to make sure that no questions asked. If you don't agree with what's found in the phase one or the phase two, and you don't want to take this on, even though you might be protected liability wise, you might not be able to do what you want to do with the property if you don't do some level of cleanup in order to get it to where it needs to be. So you want to be able to get out of that contract if the contamination isn't where you want it. And it's also a nice get out of jail free card that you can point to if you no longer want to go through with the purchase of the property. But do your phase one. Phase one will dictate if you need to do a phase two. And if the phase two, then you're going to set your baseline going forward. And if there is a facility status on that property, you're going to do a due care plan just to make sure that you're not going to increase that contamination.
Mhm. Great. So
And
from a real estate broker or an attorney standpoint, you want to make sure you put that as a contingency in the purchase agreement. And from a lender with a refi, do you usually advise them to get a copy of any existing phase one, phase two, or BEA?
I would absolutely, yeah, yeah. The more information, the better, as far as is what's going to impact that security interest for the lender.
Right. Especially if they have to foreclose on it and then they come into
Correct.
title. So,
Correct. The only
okay.
thing I would add with environmental as well is make sure that you have contingencies depending on the location of the real estate. It could be in a wetland, could be on the water. You have you have Part 301 concerns that you might have to pull permits to do the work you want to do. All of that is working with the state. There's no guarantees, as we all know, that you're going to get a permit to do what you want to do. So make
Right.
sure that there's contingencies based on the location. And that all should come out when you're doing the planning of the project or the purchase. If there's a wetland delineation, if you're on a lakefront, you should know and consult with an environmental attorney or at least a real estate attorney to identify that you're going to have to bring Eagle in. You may have to bring the Army Corps of Engineers in, and there might be some local regulations as well that prevent you from doing what you want to do just based on what's actually present at the property.
Right. Great advice. I mean, the worst thing you want to happen is that you acquire a property and you can't use it the way you wanted to use it.
Correct.
So, we're almost out of time. We do have one question. What do you think is the next trend in commercial construction or development?
Well, I think it's already happening. Well, I think the next trend is I see a slowdown just naturally based on interest rates being higher and the building costs remaining high. So I don't think you're going to have the boom you had a few years ago with low interest rates. You have a lot less, like I said before, office buildings being constructed. So
Mhm.
your commercial buildings are less office, less storefront, brick and mortar, and more mixed use, more flexible use. And what you're seeing now are a lot of construction that can facilitate future different uses. So instead of building a building that you always anticipate is going to be an office building from here to the end of time, you construct a building that maybe 10 years from now, if a tenant changes or if the market changes, you can make it into something entirely different.
Mm.
You're also seeing a lot of, and I think this has been happening for a long time, but you're seeing a lot of adaptive reuse of old buildings.
Mhm.
And I think you're going to see more of that with building costs being so high and high interest rates that instead of building from the ground up, people are going to look to renovate existing structures. One, because a lot of existing structures are cool. I mean, look at Detroit, you have all the Art Deco buildings, and that's been going on for a long time. In
Mhm.
Traverse City, where I'm located, it's not a new trend, but the state hospital is just an amazing property with all these uh, turn of the century brick buildings with clock towers and steeples and everything else. And when I was a kid growing up in Traverse City, there was, what are we going to do with this? This is an eyesore. There's high crime in that area. We should just tear them all down. Thank goodness they didn't, because now it's one of the coolest places we have in this area. You have condos, you have bakeries, restaurants, office space, anything you can imagine, all on this campus of a former mental hospital.
Right.
And it's a really neat thing. I just finished up a zoning appeal that we prevailed on for the old Kmart and Tom's grocery store in Williamsburg, just north of Traverse City, where that was a former box store and a former grocery store. Now it's pickleball courts, it's self-storage, it's
Apartments.
residential apartments. Yeah, and then there's also industrial. There's a fruit company, I think, that's distributing out of one of the buildings as well. So you're seeing a lot of different adaptive uses and mixed uses. And one of the things you need to bring in an attorney for or be cognizant of is the zoning implications of these mixed use properties, because you're bringing in so many different uses into one parcel that there isn't any zoning.
No.
that you're going to have to change the zoning. I mean, in
Right.
all circumstances, whether it's a PUD or something else, or parceling it off into different zoning parcels, it's going to have to change. So make sure, if you're going to take on a project like that, or buy into a project, or lend on a project like that, that that there's some variables that are going to have to maybe be out of your control, and hope that you can get them passed through local government.
Right. And it may take longer than anticipated.
It always does.
I know.
Yeah. Because like I said, that last one was appealed. It seemed like a great project. And, to me, it's like, who could object to this? We've had these empty storefronts that have been sitting there that look like something out of, a zombie movie for the last 10 years. And now someone wants to make it cool with all these different uses. And you'd be surprised about how many people objected and then ultimately even filed a lawsuit to appeal it.
Right.
So it took a lot longer than they were anticipating, but
I know.
we ultimately
But it
prevailed.
worked out, so that's great, and it'll be good to see.
Yep.
I want to thank you again, David, for joining us. Really enjoyed our chat today, and thank you all out in our viewing audience for joining. And we are recording this presentation, and we'll be putting it out there on our website. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Take care.